Well, hello everybody at the Relearn Festival, and congratulations to Learnlife for getting it together, for pulling together such an amazing group of people to share really fascinating and inspiring aspects of practice and thinking. And thanks for inviting me to contribute to it. I'm very happy to do so. I called my presentation, or my contribution, "You Want Change?" I think we all do. What's the plan? And I guess what the questions I want to raise today are to do with what really is our theory of change for bringing about the kind of changes that we want to see at scale. My worry is that what we are seeing is lots of wonderful, beautiful exceptions, and that we don't really have a plan of action for how to get all of this really moving into the mainstream of education, where, after all, the huge resources of the state are invested. So I think we need to give a bit of thought and a bit of time to considering whether we really have a theory of change that will be effective and bringing about shifts towards the kind of learner-centered, personalized, holistic education system that we want to see. So let me start then by sharing my screen, if I may. You'll bear with me if I'm a bit slow on taking this up. Here we go. Okay. You want change? What's the plan? And I'm haunted sometimes by this quote from Charles Payne, an American writer, educator working in Chicago, wrote in 2008, "We have so much reform and so little change," by which he meant you could see that the great kind of edifice of the state education system continued to reform at the margins, but without the kind of genuine, profound change that we have all recognized for so long is needed. And I want to share with you too a pre-COVID prediction made back in 2014 by the writers of a report from the Global Education Futures Forum. Many of you will know Pavel Luksha. And he wrote, "The coming decades will see an era of the most radical changes in education since the appearance of national education systems. And the source of the most radical changes will not be the education system itself, but rather it will be driven primarily by industries, digital technologies, healthcare, and finance." Well, of course, however good a futurist you are, it's by definition enormously difficult to predict the wildcards, the COVIDs, the pandemics, the asteroids, if you like. But boy, were they right about the source of change coming from outside the education system itself. And many people have remarked to me, we've seen 5 years change compressed into 5 months. And to an extent that's true. But the change that we've seen thus far, firstly, is primarily about the utilization of technology. And secondly, we have no guarantee that those changes actually will survive when a vaccine is eventually found. We don't know when that will be, but when this is all over, there are so many people who just want to snap back, get their old lives back. Many parents who want to see schools continuing as they used to do. Fortunately, others who want to see a big change as well. But we should not, I think, underestimate the desire for things to revert to what they were before COVID. Nevertheless, my point in sharing this with you is that radical change is within our grasp, but interestingly, it hasn't come from within the education system itself. And are we content with that? Because if we allow things to be driven by forces which are not fundamentally educational, not fundamentally, I worry about some of the outcomes that that might lead to. I think we all know the critique. The old industrial model of education struggles, to put it mildly, with learner dissatisfaction and disengagement. It simply isn't serving their needs. With growing costs of the system, and even on the old metrics, with plateauing results, actually, with frustrated workers within it, educators, teachers, teaching support staff who don't feel that they're doing the kind of job that they really came into the profession to do and would love to do. Of course, there are exceptions across the world. There are 1 or 2 systems where educators, educational professions are highly valued, highly trained and given enormous freedom, but they are in the minority. The system as it exists has very little impact on inequality. In fact, some people would argue that it actually entrenches existing inequalities. And there is a mismatch to society's needs, whether you define those needs as going further towards a more equitable society, or indeed to finding solutions that distribute and enable quality employment opportunities for all. And finally, there's a mismatch with individuals' needs. Individuals' needs to find their own personal identity, to achieve personal growth, and indeed mental health, mental good health. So we know the critique. I don't need to rehearse it at any kind of length, I know. But the edtech revolution won't solve all those problems. Just going reasonably hybrid or managing to do distance learning really efficiently goes nowhere really to solving those problems profoundly. It's unpredictable, and most of all, it's inequitable. We already know that the most advantaged continue to shore up their advantages in these circumstances. Public institutions, schools themselves, can and should be transformed. This is no moment to start talking about deschooling. That's why I'm so delighted to support Learnlife in what it's trying to do, and to remodel a public institution which is long overdue in terms of a redesign. Not saying it's outmoded, it's redundant, becoming deschoolers, everything can be done through technology, but saying no, the institution of school is immensely important for communities, only if it's redesigned though. We are celebrating beautiful exceptions, but as I've already suggested, that's simply not enough. And I think that public servants, sometimes pejoratively known as bureaucrats, can really play a part in reshaping the learning world. We have to build bridges to create the discourse, to create the dialogue that makes that happen, I believe. In short, the system transformation that we all long for should not be left to the onward march of the technophiles, to edtech, to privatization, little groupings of pandemic pods or new private micro schools who are modeling all the new features and the market. We've got to be somehow impacting the public systems. And the question for me is, what is our theory of change for doing that? As activists, it's our responsibility to start building a theory of change which has some chance of working. So I suggest there are 2 parts to it. The theory of change needs to have 2 things. One is a widely held narrative of what education is for. And I'm going to be concentrating on how we build that kind of narrative. Who is telling it? Who is believing it? Who is translating it into different kinds of language and lexicons? Plus, multiple examples of what it looks like in practice. And that, of course, is where Learnlife, it's where Relearn comes into it, because we now have available to us fantastic examples of great new practice. So this is not like La La Land, this is not just theory, this is not just a nice to have, it's out there in the world if only we're prepared to learn from it. But currently, the limits of political discourse, the ubiquitous mantra, if you like, is still all about school reform. It's a perpetuation of the existing paradigm. The usual uses of space, of time, of technology, of people, of resources. The poverty of the dominant narrative is simply not recognised. And part of our job, I think, is to start to create conditions where people can understand that education can be and needs to be so much more. And Do we need to argue that in the case of simply two of the major challenges facing mankind? Firstly, the potential to eliminate the possibility of human life on this planet, all too real, and because of the pandemic, not at the forefront of public debate or thinking at the moment, but coming down the line. And secondly, the problem, and how much is this on our minds at the moment, of the threats to liberal democracy. Now, these are issues that education needs to concern itself with. They are not somehow separate from what education is about, but rather they need to be at the heart of the task that we need to get education to do, that we need schools to address. The old objectives for education are simply no longer adequate. The question we should be getting people to ask, parents to ask, politicians to ask is, what job do we want organised learning to do? And that's the question, fortunately, that one or two systems have been asking. New Zealand, for example, have asked its communities exactly that. What job do we want organised learning to do? One of the answers they'd come up with is the fact that in a society where they've been profoundly divided on race lines in a post-colonial set of circumstances, where one sector of the population, only Maori, were excluded at every level from society, they recognise that part of the job education needs to do is to address that head on. So speaking generally, what job do we want our learning systems to do? And then that needs to be contextualised to each particular system. I've tried to set out a kind of a roadmap, if you like, for that in my last book, Thrive, published a couple of years ago, but I'm pleased to say there'll be a new edition of that coming out in 2021. And we've called it The Purpose of Schools in a Changing World. Somebody said to me the other day, purpose is the new black. Well, I certainly hope so, because the more we talk about purpose, the more we can see that reconsidering the purpose of our social institutions of schooling is an imperative. Within that book, what I've tried to do is suggest that there are 4 areas in which we need to be thriving, 4 levels that schools need to address to promote thriving for humanity. And at each one of those levels, there is a set of new learning goals. This is for debate. Of course, people will have different views about this. That's absolutely fine. But can we please start debating it, at least? So at the planetary global level, I'm suggesting our goals for young people need to be around living sustainably, protecting the Earth's ecosystem, and acquiring global competence. In fact, this is about having a completely new relationship with nature, understanding that we're not apart from nature, we are fundamentally of it. We can't stand apart from it. Secondly, if we're to thrive at the societal level, I think our learning systems, our institutions of schools, need to help learners to navigate a disrupted and uncertain landscape of work. Because employment in the next decades is going to look utterly different. And again, to this audience, I know I don't need to argue it. But secondly, we also need schools to be involved in reinventing a participative, authentic, and meaningful democracy. Because make no mistake, democracy as we used to know it is under threat. It hasn't delivered, particularly to young people. And if they're not apathetic about it, they are too often indifferent about the future of democracy. An extremely scary and worrying set of circumstances. So if democracy is to survive, I think schools need to be in the business of helping young people reinvent new forms of participative democracy in which they can believe and which they'll fight for. And the third level of thriving is around interpersonal relationships, because we all know that good lives depend on great relationships. And the final, as I remarked earlier, is around the intrapersonal. For individuals, enabling each one to secure a sense of their own self, their own identity, their own personal purpose, as well, of course, as looking after the body, your own personal sense of how you care for your fitness, your well-being, and so on. Those learning goals are not congruent with what schools are trying to do now. And as I say again, all right, if they don't fit completely, let's at least debate them. Let's ask ourselves, what is this system for? Because through that, hopefully we might start to derive a new kind of story about our learning systems that becomes commonplace, that parents will, if you ask parents what they want for their kids, so often they'll say they want them to be happy, they want them to get a job. But actually we can embroider, we can enrich that kind of discourse to something which is very meaningful for schools. Now, political power is what determines the speed, the direction, and the sustainability of change, or its status. And we will never take education out of politics. Much more significantly is the task of putting education into politics, because right now, education is right down the bottom of the pecking order of any political agenda. It never dominates a political agenda or a manifesto. It hardly even figures at election times, unless political parties promise to put more resources, more money into the education systems. Big deal. We need to insert education into political debate much more powerfully, because it is that which determines how the power of the state will be used to shape our systems. So my question is, how can we assist policymakers to construct and communicate a new narrative tuned to the realities of citizens' needs and wants? And again, it may be that COVID will help us here, because people have had a look under the bonnet, under the hood of what's going on in schools when they were locked down. They're thinking about what they really want schools increasingly to do for their kids. So maybe this is the right time to try to get a new dialogue going. But we haven't yet penetrated the political world. And unless we do that, we carry on talking to ourselves. And of course, it's not just the politicians. They are themselves influenced hugely by other players. In many jurisdictions, the unions are very powerful, not all. But have we yet got within union debates the kind of discussion that we in this festival have been talking about for some years? We are nowhere near getting the media to take this seriously. Nowhere near it. And unless we start to see the kinds of stories that put the spotlight on very different approaches to learning, then this becomes a minority interest, or stays a minority interest. And it's that which I think impacts upon public opinion. And then, of course, there are the other players within civic society, employers, business who's becoming a very useful and very more articulate critique of the existing paradigm. Think tanks, philanthropy, which in some circumstances like the US, for example, is incredibly powerful, really important in seeding very, very different kinds of experiments, schools, learning systems, and lobbyists. So our theory of action and our theory of change, I think, needs to take into account all of these players and stop talking exclusively, frankly, to ourselves. The political context in any domain, any set of circumstances, is what's critical, because how those things fit together, who holds the power, who has the loudest voice, who is influencing whom, is influenced by history, by political economy, and many other factors. And I think it's got to be a close reading, a close understanding of how those things work together that will help us make progress. So let me close by saying it's fantastic that this festival is celebrating many examples of beautiful exceptions. But we need to have a strategy to involve many, many more players, so the new and powerful paradigm becomes familiar and a different kind of story starts to get told about what education is for. I think we're close. I think it's possible now to start using some friends in the media to get this working. Maybe we should, in context, start to quite deliberately, intentionally, pick out the younger generation of politicians who might be interested in this kind of dialogue, coming in to see some of the experiments, starting to adopt the language of learner agency, of a different role for teachers, which is no less sophisticated, far more sophisticated actually, both in using technology, in personalizing learning, and thinking about a very different approach to curriculum. That's my hope for what this Learning Festival might achieve and where we ought to be going in the next 2 or 3 years post-COVID. So I'm looking forward to your questions. I might hope that you've found what I've said provocative and maybe taking us some way down the path to making progress. Thanks very much for listening.